Okay, so before we can get into the breakdown of the perceptive lens, we'll have to take a few moments to organize language properly because English it's kind of messy. It's kind of all over the place, all right? So there are three topics we're going to cover in this video, and those are first, the Trinity Matrix, second, conceptual substances, and then finally, we're going to address material practices. We're going to continue to organize language throughout the entire series. However, for now, we're going to focus on these three subjects, okay? So the way perceptive logic should function, that is, assuming it's well organized, and this goes for both perceptive modes, which we'll get into in coming installments, is that basically everything, by that I mean all perceived values, should be described according to three tiers of categorical distinction, which are in essence akin to what organized religion refers to as the Holy Trinity and what most people probably know as Father, Son, and Spirit, or Holy Spirit, okay? In principle, the Father, Son, and Spirit trifecta actually translates into A, ideation, symbolic embodiment, and or anthropomorphic rendering, which is basically the general all-encompassing description that frames all the different interpretations for perceived value. B, hierarchical arrangement and or the establisher, representative, or facilitator of authority, which is basically who or what determines a thing is actually a thing according to common understanding, okay? And then finally there's C, tools or agents of manifestation, which are in essence literal or symbolic representations of a thing according to how they'll function as perceptive building blocks when used in a given context or scope of consideration, which basically takes shape in the form of material practices, physical artifacts or phenomena, symbolic meanings, conceptual objects, or conceptual substances, which is a topic we'll be getting into shortly. All perceived values should be defined through this matrix. First, in terms of ideal or symbolically, second, in terms of authority, and then third, in terms of tool, apparatus, or agent of manifestation. I call this the Trinity Matrix. Not to be confused with the character Trinity from the Matrix movie series. That was terrible. It was terrible. Okay, the Trinity Matrix is basically how to best describe the perceptive outlook and rationale. It's considering how things function and perform at macro, meso, and micro scales of conceptual organization. Unfortunately, the reason why we've got things like synonyms and homonyms and like 13 definitions for one word, but then only like 2 definitions for this word over here. And the reason why the English language is just an absolute mess is because it's not organized according to principles. So let's break this down real quick again. Again, macro, the ideal, the father, is the symbolic embodiment, representation, or anthropomorphic rendering of a thing. It's basically the brand of or for a perceived value. Meso is the authority. The son, which is the determiner and or facilitator. Basically who or what determines and or makes decisions related to or on behalf of the perceived value. And then micro, the spirit, is the tool, the agent for accomplishment, which is basically how something manifests in the real world, okay? Got it? Doesn't matter. We're gonna go through it again, okay? Basically, describe things in ideal, then in terms of how they work through individuals' interpretations of power and determinability, and then finally as objects or objectively, in terms of how they function as physical objects, artifacts, and phenomena, conceptual substances or conceptual objects, or symbolic meanings and material practices, okay? All right, so let's give some examples to this framing in order to help it make sense. For our examples, we're going to use first a natural value, second an artifact, and then third a conceptual value, okay? We'll start with the natural value. Let's say a tree. What is a tree? Well, from a macro conceptual level, or in terms of its symbolic embodiment or anthropomorphic rendering, that is the most general and all-encompassing understanding related to the word, a tree is a fixed structure firmly rooted in its foundation from which divergent branches spring forth and bear fruits. This macro definition can apply to trees as natural values, like the trees we'd see in nature, but then also social values and structures. Just think along the lines of like a family tree, or even languages, like root languages and then branches extending from them are all modeled after the macro conception of tree. If we consider tree from a meso or authoritative level, then it means we're thinking along the lines of who or what gets to say something is or isn't a tree. One person could say, well, science lists these attributes as the defining characteristics of what makes something a tree, while another could say, well, the Bible speaks of the tree of life and the attributes you're prescribing don't necessarily fit with the framing presented in this book I take on authority. Okay, and then another person could say, well, the dictionary says, etc., etc., etc. Who or what gets to say something is a tree is a realm of categorical distinction unto itself. Oddly, this realm of conceptual organization is where most confusion occurs within the throes of human reasoning. Finally, there's tree at the micro level of consideration. Tree in terms of how it manifests and functions in reality or within the throes of a given realm of consideration. In other words, how does this thing we're calling tree function as a building block for or within the line of reasoning or within this system we're observing, okay? So how does it fit and function together with other things to give meaning to what we're perceiving? Got it? Okay. Let's try it again, but this time let's do it with an artifact, okay? So let's use the word window. What is a window? Well, from a macro level of conceptualization, a window is a small opening within a given barrier which is interpreted to represent or designed to control the level of access, entry, traverse, distribution, or escape allotted between two sides of a partition, okay? Remember, we're talking about the most general and all-encompassing understanding related to the word. From a meso level, a window's meaning changes according to who or what's describing it or the context it's being used in. Again, the meso-authoritative level is all about who or what gets to determine a thing is actually the thing it's perceived as, okay? A person could be like, we have a small window of time in which to accomplish this goal, or the eyes are the window to the soul, or to the window, to the wall. No. Wait, I'm sorry, but in the window already, in the wall, I digress, never mind. From a micro perspective, again, it's window in terms of how it manifests and functions in reality or within the throes of a given scope or realm of consideration. In other words, how does this thing we're calling window function as a building block for or within the line of reasoning we're working through or within this system that we're observing? Okay, so finally we're going to examine the Trinity Matrix as applied to a concept. Let's use the concept of God, okay? What is God? Well, from a macro level of consideration, God is the ultimate authority, that which all potential and determinability resides in. Okay. From the meso-authoritative level, who or what God is defined according to who or what seeks to determine its meaning in general or according to context. So ancient Roman and Norse gods are different than monolithic gods of modern religions as determined by and or according to various mythologies and their respective parishioners or individuals referencing them with respect to the mythologies they hail from. Finally, there's God at the micro level of organization, which again is the concept of God used as a structural building block or tenet of mechanism for or within a given scope of consideration. Okay, it's basically how the concept of God materializes in the world by way of shaping interactions between people or shaping people's actions and outlooks towards reality and all things considered. In other words, how does this thing we're calling God function as a structural building block for people in reality, ranging in everything from discourse to behavioral and attitudinal influence? How does God go from being an ideal to something that is real and makes gaugeable impacts on the world? In this sense, the concept of God becomes or functions as what I'm calling a conceptual object, and in some cases can even function as a conceptual substance, which we'll be getting into shortly, okay? I want to take a moment to clarify the difference between a conceptual object and conceptual substance, okay? A conceptual object is basically a concept, that is an envisioned, or what I'll call an idea value, that serves or functions as a structural or contextual building block for or within a given scope of consideration. Conceptual substances are going to require a bit more explanation, but they're basically any non-material value the ego can interpret for a consumable resource. Okay, we're going to get into these in just a few seconds, but let me give some examples to each of these so that it makes a little bit more sense. An example of conceptual objects would be things like barriers, obstacles, or states of being, conditions, rules or guidelines, things that give structure to intellectualism, and things along this line. And then basically conceptual substances would be things like, let's say, the value of money or credit or knowledge and factoids, status, sexual desire, contests, moral currencies like righteousness, reputation, vengeance, intimidation, things along these lines, okay? Both basically represent how concepts manifest in the experiential reality and can be seen as manifest perceptual phenomena or artifacts. Listen, I want you to keep the Trinity Matrix in mind as we progress through this series, because every aspect of the perceptive lens and supplantive OS can be explained through it, and it necessarily applies to all facets of perceptive thinking and valuation on every scale of plane, okay? In fact, if all goes well by the end of this presentation video series, you should be able to identify and then even use this framing device for yourself. And you already know, but by the way, if any of this just gets too confusing, just ask questions. Comment sections, inbox, Facebook, you know how to get at me. But back to conceptual substances. What are conceptual substances? Conceptual substances are basically idea values that produce inebriating effects. A conceptual substance can, again, be defined as any phenomenon the ego interprets for a consumable resource. It's basically an object of manifest desire, something that can be obtained in units and then traded, disseminated, or assigned and then subsequently divided, relegated, valued or devalued, stolen or hoarded. You could liken a conceptual substance to I don't know, a type of currency or different forms of drugs. Perhaps a better description for conceptual substances, though, would be any non-material value that desire can be projected onto, focused through, or interpreted from, which includes and or extends to things like symbolic meanings, especially when or if they're projected onto physical or conceptual objects or material practices. Basically, a conceptual substance is anything the ego parasite interprets through the paradigm of acquisition and loss. Any non-material value the ego seeks to acquire and hoard and then fears losing or being devalued. Symbolic meanings, material practices, and conceptual substances all work together to create a trifecta of perceptive valuation, and when projected onto or interpreted from or inspired by physical or conceptual objects, tend to imbue those values with symbolic meanings in their own right. But back to conceptual substances. Conceptual substances are insanely addictive. People can get physically addicted to conceptual substances because, again, they have an inebriating effect. Conceptual substances, material practices, and symbolic meanings, and then when those things get projected onto physical values, natural objects, artifacts, what have you, they work just like drugs. And they're just as, if not more addictive than any physical substance known to man. As a matter of fact, many physical addictions are born from addictions to conceptual substances, material practices, and symbolic meanings. And then again, when those things get projected onto physical phenomena, artifacts, natural values, what have you. For instance, OCD is an example of people being addicted to various conceptual substances as projected onto or interpreted from material practices. People who are addicted to pornography are addicted to the symbolic representation of sexual intercourse, and subsequently the idea of sexual intercourse or visual stimulation that triggers those sorts of thoughts, feelings, and chemical responses make pornography a conceptual substance in its own right. Right? In other words, the very idea of sex can trigger the autonomic nervous system to produce small quantities of the same hormone and neurotransmitter chemical compounds it would cause the body to release in an intimate situation. Therefore, the very idea of sex as facilitated through pornography functions as a type of substance in its own right, okay? A conceptual substance is basically any non-ingested value which has the ability to stimulate or trigger a reaction from the autonomic nervous system that will result in hormone and neurotransmitter chemical compounds being produced by the body, which again translates into sustenance or food for the ego parasite. Easy way to say that all is, if you can't swallow it, or inhale it, or absorb it through the skin, and the effect it has on you comes from a place of mental stimulation and not direct physical stimulation, then chances are it's a conceptual substance, okay? I'll give you some other examples of conceptual substances though. We already touched on lust, physical desire, but that guttural attraction you get to people or things so that you just want to meld with them and just want to eat them up. That's a conceptual substance. So that extends to things like romance and whatnot. But then you got vengeance, hoarding, and righteousness and piety. These are all different forms of conceptual substances people can get addicted to, just like, let's say, serial killers can get addicted to murdering, or rapists can get addicted to raping and or other predatory urges which manifest in the form of material practices. Hoarders can get addicted to collecting things that hold sentimental and in some cases just random, arbitrary, indeterminate symbolic meaning to them. That's a type of conceptual substance. Vicariously living and or attempting to self-actualize through other people's experiences is a type of conceptual substance. Hence, when people experience fandoms or become addicted to characters or actors from movies and TV series or other pervasive media platforms, or when they experience different levels of fandom towards individuals they actually have access to in their real life, i.e. crushes or things of this nature. A big one. Contest is like the most normalized, most addictive, most salient and conspicuous conceptual substance there is. People can't get enough of contests, especially here like in the United States and then also in other countries where competition is glorified throughout all levels of social stratum. People try to make contests out of everything. Literally, sports, arguments, gambling, war, politics, contest. Everyone's addicted to playing and watching other people play. Everybody's addicted to winning and seeing people or things they like or seek to define themselves by. Winning is a conceptual substance in and of itself, but that's enough of that for now. We'll get to more in coming installments. I've mentioned material practices quite often now, but I should probably explain what they are for those of you who may not be familiar with them, okay? In social sciences, material practices are basically described as habits or rituals of a physical or social, that is behavioral or attitudinal nature, which develop as a result of or are at the very least very strongly influenced and guided by interactions that form between individuals or groups of people. Another way to define material practices is as a habitual way of performing which influences or makes an impact on the world around an individual. And Another way to describe material practices is by calling them things people do as motivated by their perceptive outlooks and subsequent hopes for acquisition and desires to prevent loss. Okay? Listen, we're going to get into symbolic meanings in the coming installments, all right? But symbolic meanings, material practices, and then conceptual substances work together as a sort of trifecta of/for perceptive manifestation, and when projected onto physical phenomena, that is artifacts or what have you, they tend to imbue those values with symbolic meanings of their own. Okay, what is money without symbolic meaning? What is gold? Well, without symbolic meanings to give agency to those things, or material practices to help normalize the symbolic meanings, what you've really got is just a bunch of transmuted plant flesh and, transmuted mineral deposits, okay? But if you give symbolic meanings to them, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, man, I can't get enough of this stuff. At which point the ideation of them actually converts them, by extension of the desire to acquire them, into conceptual substances. Again, desire is the hunger behind the hunger. It's the longing, the feeling of the void.